All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. As someone just told me, happy Eris Eve to those of you who are celebrating, and also Happy New Year to those of you who are celebrating that. Very excited. Marianne Howie and I, who co-lead the CORD Connects program, are here today with a special edition, sort of late breaking news or early breaking news, depending on your perspective. Presenting an analysis of the 2022 EM match. I think a lot of us had a lot of anxiety after we saw the results last year and a lot of questions, and our speakers today have really spent a great deal of time going through data and really trying to get some conclusions on that. And so I will let our speaker panel introduce themselves, and thanks again for taking time out of your afternoon. There are a ton of you here, which is really awesome and very exciting. And so with that, we'll turn it over to our speakers.
I guess we could do it alphabetically as Alexis has made the slides. I'm Michael Bond, former program director at University of Maryland, and was on the CORD board of directors when we went through this match and worked to get this group of colleagues together to try to analyze what happened in the match. So hopefully we don't repeat everything. I want to just give a special thanks to Dan and the CORD board and Marianne to allowing us to do this special edition. I thought it was just important to get it out before we start reviewing applications so that we don't make mistakes even as we just start reviewing people. Thank you.
My name is Alisa Hayes. I'm the Vice Chair of Education at MCW, and I'm really happy to be a part of this group that has been working on this. And I want to say I take no credit for any of all the hard work that they've done due to scheduling. I have only contributed in the minorest of ways, but would look forward to working with this group or anyone else on this topic in the future.
Hi, I'm Laura Hopson. I'm the Associate Chair for Education at the University of Michigan and a member of the CORD board. And this has been an area of interest for me for several years. So I am excited to be working with this group and hopefully trying to answer some of these questions for everyone.
Given Effie isn't with us, we'll skip over. I'll introduce myself. I'm Alexis Pelletier-Bui. I'm the Associate Program Director at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University, and I'm also the EM Subspecialty Advisor there. I've worked a lot with CORD's Application Process Improvement Committee and the Advising Students Committee because, like Laura, I have a lot of interest in the residency application process in general and advising students surrounding that. I will hand it over to Jason.
Hi, everyone. Jason Reminick, CEO and founder at Thalamus. I'm a pediatrician and anesthesiologist by training, but study this in a lot of specialties. I've, in my training, worked in a few EDs and been a patient in a few others. So nice to see you all. Really appreciate CORD for allowing us to be here today. Recognize a lot of the names here. So nice to see you all, and looking forward to a great discussion on research.
All right, so we'll hop right into it. As Michael said, we thought it was really important to try to get this information out to you before the deluge of file review and interview season, because while there are things that are beyond our control, there are a few things that I think we can do when offering interviews and structuring our interview season to hopefully help prevent a similar match in this year and future years. So as we said, the 6 of us have been working together really since the spring to really try to figure out what happened with this year's match. And what we've utilized over the past few months is data from the NRMP, from ERIS, from CORD's 2022 post-match survey, and data that Thalamus has so graciously offered to share with us on interviewing behavior. And really using all of this information as well as a few publications to kind of analyze what happened here. We do have a disclosure that Jason is the founder and majority shareholder and executive leader of Thalamus. Effie, who we've also been working with, who's not here today, but we are very thankful for all of his work, is also a minority shareholder and employee of Thalamus. We want to remind our viewers here that CORD does not have any financial relationship with Thalamus, and this talk is in no way an attempt to endorse any product or offering. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and questions related to the research that Thalamus is presenting today are certainly allowable, but we are not going to host any questions related to the actual product of Thalamus. All right, so let's start with talking about the facts of what actually happened this year. So if we are looking at unfilled programs and positions, comparing last year to this year, we can see that last year in 2021, the numbers were pretty similar to what they've been over the past 10 years. So about 0.5% of positions went unfilled, so 14 out of 2840. Again, that is very similar to the past 10 years, and only 3.3% of programs went unfilled in 2021. Obviously, we all know that we underwent a huge increase in that this past year, going up to 7.5% of positions, or 219 out of 2921, affecting a quarter of our residency programs going unfilled. So when we compare our specialty to other specialties experience in 2022, we wanted to see, was EM an outlier, or was this an issue across all specialties? And really, it does seem like, unfortunately, EM is an outlier here. I included here on this graph the 3 other specialties that seem to have a slight increase in unfilled programs and unfilled positions in the 2022 match. Which was affected the most after EM was FM, family medicine, going from 17.8 to 23.6% of unfilled programs, and 7.3 to 9.5% of unfilled positions. But you can see, even with FM, a much smaller increase compared to the increase that we experienced in emergency medicine. If we look at a regional breakdown of the positions that went unfilled in emergency medicine, really all regions were affected. However, our central and southern positions were affected the most, with our western coast being affected the least. And if we take a look at those 69 programs that did not fill, we also found some interesting information. So if we look at the programs that are new in the past 5 years, 20 of those 69 programs were new in the past 5 years. And that's not including those programs that went from the AOA to ACGME transition. If you include those programs, that's an additional 26 programs. So technically 46 that are new to ACGME, but really only 20 that are now formally AOA. About a third of the programs had only 1 open position, but about a quarter had 5 or more open positions. So really kind of running the gamut there. And one for-profit healthcare conglomerate in particular accounted for 11 of the programs, or 23% of the positions. So let's talk about that in context of trends over the years to see, can we identify, was this a long time coming, or was this really just a blip on the radar? So first, I do want to take a little bit of time to look over this slide. So these are applicants to emergency medicine utilizing the ARIS data. So looking at our allopathic, osteopathic, and IMG applicants. You can see the overall numbers have been pretty stable over the past 5 years, with really the exception of last year. So last year was a bit more of a blip. And we've had some thoughts, no data to support these theories, but one of the things that I was thinking is, do we have this increase because, remember, this is the very beginning of the pandemic. In the beginning of the pandemic, emergency physicians were seen as the heroes, and were students kind of seeing us as like the ideal doc. Also during this time, our students unfortunately had very truncated clinical experiences, and were making decisions based on virtual clerkships that were truncated to a couple weeks. So really we're making a lot of uninformed decisions, and maybe that just happened to kind of go in the favor of emergency medicine. So then 2022, yes, we had a decrease in 760 applicants from 2021, with the largest component being in our applicant pool, or allopathic applicant pool, down by 425. But again, the overall number is pretty stable. However, if we're looking at that bottom part of the bar graph, our allopathic applicants, you can see that in 2022, we're really at the lowest number that we've ever had or at least in the past 5 years, of allopathic applicants. Again, it's just 1 year, but we really haven't had a significant growth in the applicant pool in the allopathic area. So something to kind of think about as we move forward is our applicant pool changing a little bit, and we'll cover that again in a couple slides. So why did we see this decrease this year? Again, we have a lot of theories. Were we scaring applicants away? I can say as an EM advisor, I know this workforce study has certainly played a role in at least my students' decision into whether or not to go into emergency medicine. I have had some that have been interested in, based on this and the fear of potentially not having a job in the future, they've decided to pursue another specialty. And it makes sense, right? They're spending a lot of money, a lot of time going to medical school. That's a lot of debt. And then to go to residency for 3 to 4 years and have to potentially move to a different geographic location where they don't have a support system just to find a job in the specialty that they're training in is something that might not be particularly palatable. And then of course with APP, scope creep as well, covered in this workforce report. Those are some concerns that some of our students may have. And then, of course, the pandemic, right? So in the beginning, we were the heroes, but obviously the pandemic has had a large toll on all of our healthcare workers, but especially in the emergency department, especially with burnout, right? So actually, you know, people always say emergency medicine, high rates of burnout. Yes, but if you look at Medscape's burnout survey in 2020, so right before we experienced the pandemic here in the US, EM was actually in the middle of the pack as far as burnout goes. 43%, yes, not a great number, but certainly not at the top at that time. But post-pandemic, we have shot right back up to the top at 60% of our EM docs reporting burnout. And so that may also be playing a role in scaring some of our EM or potential EM applicants. And lastly, the corporatization of medicine in general, but with some of our emergency medicine programs also being taken over by some of these corporate entities, that may be playing a role as well. As we mentioned earlier, about a quarter of the positions were that were unfilled were all by one large for-profit organization. So again, don't have any data to support any of these theories, but just some things that we were thinking about. All right, so let's get back to our trends. If we're looking at the average applications per EM applicant over the past 5 years, we actually have stabilized over the past 3 years, as you can see here. Unlike other specialties, which continue to see increases. I can't tell you why it's the case that we've stabilized. I would like to say it's because the advising students committee and the application process improvement committee have been really great in getting our advising out there and making sure everybody's on the same page. But honestly, I don't know why we've been fortunate to have that stabilization, but we have. And so if you couple that with the applicants decreasing this past year, obviously, if those numbers have stabilized and the total applications to EM decreased significantly this past year by 41,000 total applications to EM. And then if you look at the average applications per program, so this is taking into consideration the number of programs, again, the number of applicants decreasing and those apps per applicant stabilizing, that led to about an average of 169 less applications per program in 2022 compared to 2021. When you compare that to the number of emergency medicine residency positions over the past 5 years, that obviously has been increasing pretty steadily. You can see how things get a bit unbalanced pretty quickly. And let's kind of go back to that last slide, but expand it out for the past 10 years, looking at, again, the number of EM residency positions. So you can see in almost 10 years, we've had an increase in, or doubling almost, of the number of residency positions. And this is also multifactorial. A lot of people have thought, oh, it's just because new programs are opening. But we know that 50 programs actually underwent the transition during this time period from AOA to ACGME. Yes, there were 78 new programs in addition, but we've also been seeing existing programs expanding their complements as well. So lots of reasons why these positions have been increasing. So when we compare that graph of the number of positions over the past 10 years to the number of EM residency positions, to the number of EM residency applicants using NRMP data now. So this is a little slightly different than ARIS data that I showed you earlier. The ARIS data is all people who apply to emergency medicine. So those who are dual applying, those who may not even be ranking any EM programs. Now the NRMP data is those who are ranking emergency medicine programs. And you can see now that that gap has closed pretty significantly, at least in 2022, where we had a large excess in the past of applicants and people ranking EM compared to our positions. That gap has closed a lot. And then we'll talk about how that looks in the context of our applicant pool as well. So if we're going back to that slide I showed you before of applicants to emergency medicine based on ARIS data and plotting that across the gray line here, which is the number of available EM positions, we don't look like we're in terrible shape, right? It looks like we still have an excess of applicants applying to EM, but obviously kind of the applicant pool and the percentage of those applicants, potentially taking up those positions are changing a little bit. But if we're then looking at the NRMP data, so those who are actually ranking EM, you see that that pool is really, that gap has really narrowed pretty significantly. So in this past year in 2020, we didn't have even enough allopathic and osteopathic applicants to fill all of those positions. And so that line now of the number of applicants is just slightly above the number of available positions. And then if we look at those who actually filled the positions in emergency medicine, we see the biggest decrease in our allopathic pool again. So from 2021, 62% of the positions were filled by allopathic applicants, and this past year, 54.5%. Also a slight decrease in osteopathic applicants with an increase in IMG applicants. So it's hard to say, again, this is just 1 year of data, whether or not this is a trend, but certainly something to think about, especially as you're starting to review files and offer interviews, that this applicant pool may be changing. You may want to consider applicants that you may not have previously considered as far as the osteopathic or IMG pool, because again, our allopathic pool, at least from last year, seemed to decrease pretty significantly. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Jason now to talk about applicant interviewing practices.
Thanks, Alexis. And so, yeah, we like to think of the application season as kind of 3 different markets: the applicant pool, obviously, and the match pool, but also the interview pool. And things that are happening at the interview level can, of course, affect what happens at the match level as well. So we talk about this a lot with a lot of specialties, just this whole idea of monopoly on interviews, or more colloquially, interview hoarding, as has come about within sort of the GME community, and the idea of over-interviewing overall. So we're kind of going to dive deep into the interview data here. So next slide, please. So are applicants over-interviewing? And overall, it's a myth. And I think the data can kind of speak to itself. So next slide over as well. So we kind of looked at over-interviewing starting in anesthesiology. We have a paper in review also in primary care that looked at if a specialty eliminated those interviews that had less than a 5% chance of match probability. And so there's a lot of interviews that have a very low chance of match. So looking at kind of anesthesia, if you're the average anesthesia program and you wanted to eliminate any interview with an applicant who had less than a 5% chance of matching at your program, and you wanted to be pretty confident about it at a 95% confidence interval, the average anesthesia program in the country could eliminate 18% of their interviews, and they would still match the exact same class. There'd be no change to the final match list. For primary care, for family medicine, internal medicine, and peds, that number actually jumps to 35%, which is clearly a very large number of interviews. We haven't formally looked at emergency medicine yet, but just given what we know about the specialty and the size, we expect it's still close, it's overall probably closer to the anesthesia population, but still, this is a large number of interviews overall. So there's a lot of interviews happening that overall are a very low likelihood of match. It's also worth noting that the number of applicants dual applying into multiple specialties continues to go up year over year, and the average applicant is now applying to 1.61 specialties, where in the year prior, it was about 1.58. So that's continuing to creep up pretty steadily year over year. And this whole idea of, are only the top applicants aggregating the majority of the interviews and taking interviews away from other applicants in the pool is a concern amongst the community, but we find that more to be an outlier than the norm. And so next slide. And that kind of brings to the question, is everyone interviewing the same people? Is the interview hoarding leading to the event that only the top applicants get most of the interviews? They're all going to all the programs around the country or within a region. And of course, they can only pick one. So that leaves an absence of spots for other applicants, et cetera. And so next slide, please. And so really, we have not found any evidence of interview hoarding, and we've looked at this in a number of different ways across specialties. This graph here is showing the mean percentage overlap of interviews at various programs. So if you were to take two programs in a specialty and you looked at the list of applicants that they invited to interview and you compared them on average, you picked any two programs on average, you would expect in most of the residency specialties to overlap about 5 to 15%, meaning 5 to 15% of names on both lists were the same person. And so we've looked at that across all of the major residency specialties. The most competitive we've ever found is in peds surgery as a fellowship. That's a very small fellowship. It's incredibly competitive. They have about 80 applicants a year to 40 programs, each interviewing for one slot. That is the most extreme case of overlap that we've seen at about 60%. All of the other residency specialties and a lot of the fellowships overlap on the 5 to 15% range. And so looking at emergency medicine, which is the second bar there, 2020 is the red bar, 2021 is the teal bar, and 2022 is the blue bar. We see that there was a slight increase in the amount of overlap overall, but it still fell within all the error bars. We've seen similar increases and decreases across every given specialty that we've looked at, which overall just seems to be more market fluctuations or applicant pool fluctuations rather than true changes in interview distributions overall. And so really no residency specialty, including emergency medicine, saw any notable change from 2020 to 2022. Next slide, please. And so we looked at the program distributions and saw that those really didn't change. And then so back to the narrative, are there small portions of applicants holding most interviews? And we've looked at every single specialty, including emergency medicine, including the most competitive specialties. We have about 35% of programs using Thalamus right now in emergency medicine. And that is kind of middle of the pack for us. We have some specialties that are using 50 or 60%, some that are in the 20 to 25% range. Whichever amount of programs we have and applicants to draw this curve, I think is really important to look at, because if there were true interview hoarding, and this is showing in pediatrics, for instance, but emergency medicine shows a very similar curve, as does most specialties, looking at the number of applicants on the y-axis versus the total number of invitations they've received. And so as you can see, given the pediatrics penetration we have, the majority of applicants actually have very few interviews in comparison to the number of applicants that have many, many, many interviews. Does this not mean that there are some applicants in emergency medicine interviewing at 30, 40, 50, 60 programs? There are, but they are very much the outlier rather than the norm. And so it's a very, very small percentage of candidates that are doing that. We've actually started to look at this and just submitted an abstract with some of our colleagues in orthopedic surgery, looking at if you took the applicants, the very small pool of applicants that interview at 30, 40, 50, 60 places, and you redistribute their interviews to the rest of the applicant pool, overall, it has a very minimal effect on the mean of interviews applicants are receiving. It almost moves it not at all. And what is the greater effect, which I think also is relevant here, is when you change the number of applicants versus the number of match positions. That has a much greater effect on the overall match outcomes than the redistribution of interviews from the very, very top of the distribution curve to the rest of the applicant pool. And so the question then we then get out of that is, regionally, are applicants just interviewing in the same region? And the answer here is maybe, but also that's what you would expect given just regional preferences and state preferences. And we'll talk about same state overall in just a second. But we as humans and as people who grew up and have hometowns tend to prefer staying close to home. And so if you wanted to stay close to home in a competitive process, you would apply to similar places that are close to home. And so we overall, though, don't still see any sort of egregious amount of hoarding overall. And I want to try and get the community away from that term because I think it just creates unnecessary anxiety and panic against both applicants and programs. But overall, just kind of looking at this applicant pool, seeing where people are applying. We looked at also slicing and dicing by USMLE quartile, by AOA, gold humanism, by grades. However we sliced and diced this, we could not find any incidents of where you would see at the top of the curve this spike in applicants having additional interviews. And so I think this speaks to a lot of just how data can help display the interview market as well. And this exponential decay is kind of what you would expect overall. So next slide, please. And really other issues with the match in 2021. We're missing some data here. Okay, in general, we found amongst unmatched programs that are using our software, those that went unmatched versus those that did match invited 10 to 15% less applicants to interview than they had in the year prior, and also ranked 10 to 15% less applicants than they had prior as well, which given what we see in terms of the application data was a non-compensatory behavior. In some cases, you would probably want to interview more applicants given the decrease of applicants that existed. And so this was also a contributing factor to the overall outcome as well. Next slide, please. And a lot of this also stems, as I've kind of alluded to, from the role of geography overall. So kind of jumping into the data on the next slide. This is a paper we looked at in anesthesia, looking at interview data over a 4-year period, and we're able to very conclusively conclude that same state geography, meaning an applicant grew up in a state, was from the state, or went to medical school in that state, was the largest driver of them matching in that state. And so looking at Kansas as the example in the middle of the map there in the yellow, grow up in Kansas, go to medical school in Kansas, highest likelihood of matching in Kansas. That effect falls off as you move to the neighboring states and the neighbors' neighbors and the neighbors' neighbors' neighbors, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, applicants travel anywhere. I grew up in New York. I went to residency in California. I now live in Tennessee. But from a macroeconomic perspective, same state is a large driver. We have a paper in review in primary care right now that shows very much the same trends. And so, these trends are pretty large. For the anesthesia study, let's say you grew up in California or went to medical school there, you had a 58% chance a priori of matching there versus an 18% chance if you grew up outside of California. And you could do this with any state in the country, in any region. They vary slightly. But in primary care, similarly, one of the major takeaways we found was if you were an applicant who wanted to stay in state, and did stay in state, or an applicant who didn't want to stay in state and left, those two pools were successful 80% of the time. So same state is a very large driver, more so than region, and in some ways even geographic distance based on this study. So we have not yet looked at emergency medicine, but it's something we're looking at within this group in the research that we're doing. So next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Hey, so Alexis, can you queue up the next slide? So the question becomes, what do we do with all this data? We can sort of hide and ignore it, or try to think about how it may shape our own behaviors around the time of interview. Next slide. So we've already heard about some of the data around geography. We've known about this within emergency medicine for quite some time. With a survey-based study that occurred after the match, basically saying that students prioritize geography above everything else. Now, what does that actually mean? Because to me, in Michigan, we're all convinced that everyone wants to go to California, Texas, and Florida. I talked to my California colleagues, and they're like, we can't get anyone out here. Everyone wants to come out and visit for the interview, but doesn't really want to match here. So we all have our own perspectives of what desirable geography is. Next slide. What we have seen in a number of venues is that people tend to stay where they are. It's really hard to break the inertia to move people out of their region or at least away from home. So these are just some figure grabs from a number of studies. Some of these are from emergency medicine, some of them for other specialties. But what you see over and over again is whilst there is a population of people who are willing to move from New York to San Francisco or all the way across the country, a lot of people stay geographically close to where they are. Next slide. So let's think about how we plan with this. Here's one other data point that I want to throw out there. In a large study that a number of emergency medicine programs collaborated on and shared data looking at the milestones as measures of outcomes, as well as measures of outcomes in areas like research, leadership, community engagement. Our inputs do a lousy job at predicting who our superstars are. So we need to look at people as a whole and get away from being fixated on any one single score as the panacea to identify who we want in our program. Next slide. So let's talk about how we use this. Next. So I can't find an attribution to this, but I found this figure in multiple places around the internet and thought this very nicely summarized what we're dealing with. We have a large area of items that we're worried about, that concern us, but that we can't control. There's a much smaller set of items that we can influence and an even smaller set of things that we can actually control during our interview process. Next slide. So if we think about what we can influence, we've all seen these diagrams before. You know, these segments, if you measure them out, are exactly the same, but our brain tells us that they're different. And really what we need to respect is that we can provide or try to optimize the experience people have, but what people perceive, it matters to them. Next slide. So I would encourage everyone to think about how do we market our programs, how do we brand ourselves, how do we give applicants the best possible experience when they're interacting with our programs, particularly in the virtual environment. So that means going through your website. I know when we first went back through our website, we started looking at it and went, oh God, that picture is 8 years old, or these people have all graduated. Why are they here? Or what a horrible picture. So really thinking about what it is that we're demonstrating to the outside world. Is that concordant with who we are? Is it concordant with our resources, our mission, our vision, and our values? And is it presented in a way that gives people a good experience? Do we want people walking off because the website is difficult to use and that serves as a barrier? So looking at what you have. And there are a couple of manuscripts there, both from within emergency medicine that are JGME publications and available open source if for people's reference. Next slide. We also have the opportunity to think about who we are in the in-person environment. Many, but not all of us, may have the opportunity to conduct in-person second looks at some point during the season. I know this is a moving target for many people, and we don't know how this is going to play out, but how do we demonstrate who we are to people who we do have on site? How do we make sure that we portray this as a warm and welcoming environment? And this can be as simple as who's hanging on the walls. You know, do we have a diverse representation of individuals involved in our departments on the walls? Do we inadvertently project exclusion by some of the images we give? And I've, in talking with students and recent applicants, that sometimes those in-person visits are most valuable for the unscripted things that they hear. How do nurses and docs interact? How do the residents interact? What are the intangible little cultural items that are left around the offices? Next slide. I would also challenge you to think about the intangibles and how we communicate information in the virtual interview environment. There's a very nice paper by one of my colleagues, some of our colleagues in pediatrics, actually also out of the University of Michigan, about how information flows in the virtual environment and where you lose information. So the virtual environment is not as information rich as the in-person environment. We do have some information degradation and loss there, but how do we make this an easy, seamless experience? How do we try to proactively create some sense of our environment and community in the virtual environment is, I think, going to be an important question for all of us to wrestle with. Go ahead, next slide. When we think about the things we actually can control, and this would not have been the thermostat in my hotel room the other day that had no bearing on reality, but we think about what we can actually control. Next, we can control who we invite. Next, and we can control how we assess them. And as I mentioned previously, our parameters for what makes a successful resident, the things that we look at are not great predictors. AOA status is terrible. USMLE scores don't necessarily predict our superstars. So how do we go about this? So one possibility that may be concordant with some of this messaging on expanding our applicant pool next is to really think about what our program mission is and be really trying to identify for ourselves what are the characteristics of applicants who are successful in our program, and not necessarily is it men, is it women, is it old, is it young, is it this background, racial or ethnic background, but what are the behaviors and interests and characteristics of the applicant that match with who we are? Is it research focused? Is it critical care focused? Is it service focused? Map out your own program and recruit, do some mission-based recruiting so we move everyone towards the same goal. Next slide. This is also compatible with a topic that we've all heard about, and that's holistic application review. The AAMC has some tremendous resources for holistic review in the GME as well as the UME environment. And this is really looking at the sum total of someone's experiences and attributes, as well as metrics. Metrics and what do they bring to be a physician at your shop? Next slide. The other thing holistic review does, and this was very nicely demonstrated by two of our colleagues, is it really works towards many of our shared goal of diversifying our programs and representing different backgrounds and experiences within our own program. And this is able to be done, if you look at some of these publications, without degrading the quality of our trainees. It just diversifies our trainees without upending quality. And again, next slide. The AAMC and some of their resources also has some very nice exercises that you as programs can go through to say, hey, this is really important to me. So for some programs, a leadership role or leadership experience may come out as something they really want to screen for within their applications. For other people, that distance traveled, that how far have I, what kind of barriers have I overcome may really be a priority. And if you listen to Eric Worm, who is doing a lot of work around competency-based medical education and admissions reform in the internal medicine space, this is one of the things that they really prioritize. It may not be the right priority for everyone, but I think reflecting on what we and our own programs value is going to be important. And there are a number of these checklists that you can go through that cover different topics. Next slide. So if information is power, we need to not only know what we can influence and what we can control, we also need to know how to react and adapt. And next slide, I would encourage everyone to get familiar with the ERIS sites and the data releases. They do release data about application statistics and update it on roughly a monthly basis. Usually the first information drop occurs sometime in early October. So hopefully we'll see that in the next few weeks. And we will try to release that and a flag to that en masse on some of the CORD listservs as soon as we see that go up, so that everyone can be aware and that we can stay on top of what some of these trends may be, even before many of us hopefully release our interview offers, and we can make some more informed decisions as to what our applicant pool looks like. Next slide. And this falls into the spirit of staying nimble and agile, being willing to adapt and move. And next slide. So just to summarize, what can we do? We may have to make on the spur of the moment adaptations for the number and types of applicants that we invite and rank based on information like the ARIS data. We can make sure that we rank as many of our applicants as possible. We know every now and then there's someone that is just a non-starter for whatever reason, but the vast majority of the people you interview, you should be willing to rank. Need to think strategically about how you geographically distribute your interview offers. Certainly, if I never interview someone from California on general principles, I'm never going to rank someone from California. But what is the appropriate proportion, maybe based on historical trends within your own program? You may want to say, hey, I want X% within my geographic region, Y% within my state, and I'm going to whatever 100 minus X minus Y, we reach out beyond that. I think also thinking critically about what is the profile of an applicant that you typically match, and what are the things that you value, and making sure you match those elements to your own program is going to be important. And also looking at the applicant pools that you may not have considered in the past. There's some darn good osteopaths out there. There's some darn good IMGs out there. My own program can attest to that. But figuring out how to work through sometimes different tests, different life experiences, different documents is going to be important for all of us to continue to find and recruit people who are going to excel in emergency medicine. And I'll turn this back over to Alexis for any to moderate any questions that come up.
Thank you. Actually, I don't know that I have access to the chat, so I may need Marianne or somebody from the core side, Dan, to.
I'm monitoring it. I don't see anybody.
We would be very happy. There isn't anything in the chat yet.
Oh, great.
So please put your questions in the chat and we are happy to relay them.
If you'd rather unmute yourself and ask the question, I suppose that's probably okay too. Is that?
That's totally fine.
This is the moment where I'm always unsure if we did an amazing job and just answered every question and addressed the topic so thoroughly, perfectly, there are no questions left, or we put everyone to sleep.
So, you know, it certainly sounds, one of the places that I worked at as a PD was a place that I was taking from the AOA to the ACGME. And I think one of the challenges in that was realizing that in widening the pool for the osteopathic residencies, where the good applicants were going to be able to join any of the ACGME residencies, that was going to be a challenge on the other side for the primarily osteopathic programs in the past. I'm wondering, one of the things that I didn't see in your data was the stuff about the programs that were traditionally osteopathic previously. Are they having more of a problem in hitting the match last year, or were they doing the same as the rest of us?
Yeah, so it looks like 26 of the 69 programs were previously AOA. I didn't calculate out, but I could probably figure that out, you know, what percentage of is that. Actually, it's a higher percentage, I guess, if you consider there's 50 that There's 56 that underwent the transition, 50 in that 10-year period that I was looking at. So 26 divided by 56, so that's 46% of previously osteopathic programs. So 69 minus the 26, 43.
I mean, I know one of our local, very well
Go
One of
ahead.
our local, very well-regarded osteopathic programs had about half their spots go unmatched.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's perhaps a pattern there for those programs, or is that just a local phenomenon?
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like a higher proportion of our programs that went from the AOA to ACGME transition went unmatched than our allopathic or other programs. Yeah.
Brian Allen asked, so Thalamus data showed that on programs that didn't fill, those programs interviewed 10 to 15% less people and ranked a similar number of fewer applicants. Any insights as to why this may have happened?
Yeah, I can take that, obviously. And so anecdotally, I think what happened was for the 2020 season, which would be the 2021 match, programs across the country in all specialties invited more people to interview because it was from the switch to in person to virtual, and everyone was very concerned about interview hoarding and just not interviewing enough applicants. And programs, I think, were the most nervous ever of going unfilled kind of universally across all specialties and programs. And that didn't happen that year because, one, a lot of applicants applied, programs interviewed more applicants, applicants completed more interviews normally than they do on average. And so everyone had longer rank lists, which builds some sort of safety and buffer into the match. And so I think, probably rightly so, they assessed and said, this is also only anecdotal based on what we think happened, but okay, that didn't happen in 2020. We're interviewing virtually again. This feels kind of very similar to that year, except what happened in emergency medicine is that the pool changed dramatically. So if you were going to with the pandemic and all of a sudden everyone needed toilet paper and there was less toilet paper in stores, like there wasn't as many people to pick from. And so especially just the drop in the allopathic candidates affected that, I think, a lot as well. And so overall, with the applicant pool changing as drastically as it did so quickly, I would say that there just wasn't an awareness amongst the community about the large drop in applicants throughout that time, and that would be my guess.
I could put it a more blunt way too. I think after speaking to a couple of the PDs, I think we got a little cocky. Our applicant pool kept
Mark
going
Weinstein
up.
is asking, what is the increase in total?
Sorry. I think we got a little cocky with our rank list. I talked to a bunch of PEDs that just didn't rank everybody they interviewed. And one of the things I just really want to encourage people is if you took the time to interview them, rank them, unless you absolutely would quit if they came to your program. But I don't think there's no harm in ranking everybody that you interviewed. And it gives you that additional buffer too. Sorry, Marianne.
I was just going to the next question, so I think I was a good answer in between anyway. Mark Weinstein's asking, what is the increase in total EM positions that will be offered this year in comparison to the total number of EM positions that was offered last year? Good question.
So I think based on the data we have, we have incomplete data at this point until we find out how many people enter how many positions in the match. If you look at number of accredited programs, we're at 277 in last year. We are at 277 programs in last year's match. Pulling up the ACGME site, there are currently 282 programs accredited, and I'm aware of a few programs as well that are awaiting expansions. So I don't think our numbers are going down unless we start to see people pulling positions out of the match voluntarily.
We got to be really careful with that. Everybody wants to keep blaming the expansions and new programs, and there definitely is some of that. But a lot of the older, more established programs keep expanding too, and that's really adding to the numbers a lot.
Yeah, I've seen, and we did not delve into the exact breakdown, but I've seen in other sources that it's roughly a 50-50 contribution from new programs and old programs expanding, or existing programs expanding.
Mm-hmm. Pastor is adding that as a former AOA program, he definitely than I did in the AOA match, but matched all our positions fortunately. Jennifer Cassidy is saying EMARC had a recruitment kickoff social last night and some programs have hit roadblocks when it comes to updating their website, approval to create social media accounts and recruitment videos. What advice is
So the final is, what advice does this group have for those roadblocks? That's really hard because that's so institutional dependent. To try to get up into the C-suite to realize, but so many institutions are so afraid of social media. But unfortunately, like not having Instagram in this day and age just means you're old and have either bald or gray hair. And programs need to get that message out there. So I don't know really how to do that, but you have to attack it at the institutional level.
Yeah, I think going at it with data. So some of those publications that Laura had put up on our slide, and I can see if I can go back to it. Like if you go to the C-suite with some of this information showing that this is what residency programs are doing, hopefully that can help support this and let them know that it's so incredibly important in this day and age in recruiting, especially in the setting of, you know, our recent match experience. We want to do everything we possibly can to maximize our match experience. So yeah, it's one of those things where as much data as you can provide, the better I think your chances are, but it is really hard when you're going up against that.
This is
Yeah.
definitely where you don't want to do mother may I, you want to do dad please forgive.
Yeah.
I mean, I think knowing your own institutional rules, the rules do change because we went from an unofficial residency Instagram and Twitter account that might have been run by the residents with no knowledge of the program director officially, to actually having a social media director for the institution that said, this is the way people are engaging and we want to see our programs out there. And we actually want you to, you know, at us, and here's a list of addresses we want, and we'll amplify your tweets. But we will follow, you know, they also, you know, occasionally you'll hear back from them going, do something about that one. But for the most part, our folks have been pretty respectful and very cognizant. We've had more problems with personal accounts than far more problems with personal social media postings than anything representing the program. And it is very clear that the applicants interact with them.
Yeah, I think just given, you know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, GME overall was looking at social media as a big negative. Applicants were hiding who they were, changing their names on their social media profiles. Now you have applicants introducing themselves to Med Twitter, sharing who they are and what they're hoping to achieve. And I've noticed this very noticeable shift over the last 2 to 3 years. There are influencers on social media making videos on TikTok and such. And so a lot of GME discussion has moved to social media, as a lot of things have. And so I think that's a lot of the place where this generation of applicants is looking for things is online as well.
It looks like Marianne keeps freezing, but the question is, do you have thoughts on the large number of open positions in that single large for-profit corporate conglomerate? Was it lack of interest from applicants or something about how they were interviewed / ranked?
I don't know. Jason, did you have any interview data from those particular programs? I don't know if they used Interview Broker.
No, so I don't have any insight into how that would have been done or why.
Yeah, I know that looking at some of the websites for the programs that are associated with that large number of positions, they were non-functional or very scant. I don't know if that played a role, and again goes back to branding yourselves and making sure that you have functioning websites. But other than that, I don't really know any additional details on those particular programs. I don't know if anybody else on the call does.
I do know a bunch of them were brand new approvals and stuff like that too, which always makes it a little bit hard to recruit for your first class because there's no track record.
Yeah, I think there are some structural things. I would agree. We spent a lot of time trying to track down all the programs, and we actually had trouble telling some of them apart. So I think there may be some naming, website, internet presence issues underlining some of this in addition.
One other thing that comes to mind that I've heard through just working in the community is that some of these organizations, you need special approval to interview applicants that fall outside a certain range on scores or particular types or sponsoring of visas, et cetera. So that creates an additional hurdle for the programs to invite people that fall outside those ranges as well.
Jennifer Chapman believes those rules are finally being relaxed.
I would say, given the change in the allopathic number, which I think is a large driver of a lot of this, I think that's a lot of what might have happened there too.
I will say my medical school has been very traditional. They never would let IMGs or DOs rotate with us because we're an allopathic school. And this year I'm happy to report that DOs have been able to report with us, which is really nice, or rotate with us. Still no IMGs, but we're slowly getting to be more open. So it's very helpful.
All right, it looks like maybe we have gotten our final comment. Last chance. So thank you very much on behalf of the CORD board and on behalf of Marianne and myself for doing this session. I think lots of really interesting data. I don't know if anyone else is feeling a little anxious the night before it all begins again, but I think it's really helpful to inform and definitely dispel the rumor that I have been hearing and probably propagating about the interview hoarding. For me was a really important take home, and really just thinking more about who we're looking at and bringing in, I think. So it's really great. Thank you so much for putting this together so quickly and bringing it to our group.